Okay, now if we turn to Ibn Atiyah, he was, he was born about 50 years after al-Baghawee, born in 481, and he died in 541 after the Hijrah. His name was Abdul Haq ibn Ghalib al-Andalusi. His book is called al-Muharrar al-Wajiz fi Tafsir al-Kitab al-Aziz, and Muharrar has the sense of being edited and made precise, and Wajiz means short, and it's a middle length tafsir. It's not that short. The Moroccan version, it's in something like at least 9 volumes, I believe, and it wasn't published until fairly recently. I believe the first printed version of it came out in either the 80s or the 90s. Now, the book was pretty influential for a while in the Islamic West in particular. Ibn Atiyah, he lived in Andalus. He was born in a village near Granada, and his life overlapped almost completely the period of the Murabitun in Spain. The Murabitun had come to Spain on an invitation from some of the petty kings, and they had annihilated the Christian forces that were beginning to reconquer Spain at the Battle of Zalata. And that was 2 years before Ibn Atiyah's birth. And then they decided to get rid of all these petty kings that were one of the main problems with the Muslim losses to the Christians, because these petty kings would ally themselves with the Christians to fight Muslims, and then the Christians would nibble away at Muslim lands bit by bit. So the Murabitun got rid of all those petty kings, and the scholars in Spain vigorously supported them in that campaign. And so the Murabitun, whose whole the foundation of their state was jihad and Islam, and the scholars really supported them, and they in turn really supported the scholars. So you had a real era of tremendous support for knowledge in North Africa and in Spain. And so among the contemporaries of Ibn Atiyah were Ibn al-Arabi, the great Maliki faqih and the author of Ahkam al-Qur'an, which inshallah we'll be looking at shortly, next episode. Not next, but soon. And also Qadi Ibn Rushd, who was the grandfather, probably the more famous Ibn Rushd, the philosopher, but he was Ibn Rushd, the grandson, was also famous for his fiqh. He wrote Bidayat al-Mujtahid, one of the greatest books of fiqh in Islamic history. But his grandfather Ibn Rushd was also a major faqih. He was a judge in Cordoba. And Qadi Iyad, who worked for a while in Spain, but he was more based in Morocco and died there. And he's famous for his book Ash-Shifa, about the Prophet ﷺ, among others. So those were some of Ibn Atiyah's contemporaries. And Ibn Atiyah, he gets his name from his great-great-great-grandfather, who was in that first army that conquered Spain for the Muslims. As far as the influences of Ibn Atiyah in his tafsir, it seems that he relied heavily on al-Tabari for his attributions of opinions of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. He sometimes quotes him, sometimes he takes from him without attribution. And he also mentions his tarjihat, his opinions, when he thought an opinion was stronger than another. And he agrees with him sometimes and disagrees with him others. And another mufassir that he quotes frequently is Abu Bakr al-Naqash, who was an Iraqi scholar, is considered weak in general. He was accused of lying in hadith, and his tafsir is packed with Israeliyat and fantastic stories. However, Ibn Atiyah doesn't use any of that material, really. But he mentions Naqash's comments from time to time, frequently criticizing them. And sometimes he says, وَهَذَا مُحْتَمَلٌ, that's possible. So sometimes he goes along with him. Abu al-Abbas al-Mahdawi, a Moroccan scholar who died in 430, he sometimes quotes him without comment and sometimes with agreement. Sometimes he criticizes him. And Makki ibn Abi Talib, al-Qaysi, al-Andalusi, the same thing. And as far as his methodology, he's considered to be one of those who combined ma'thur and ra'i. One of the things that he does, which is different from al-Baghawee, is that he dispenses with the isnads altogether, and he hardly even, he'll occasionally refer to the book that the narration came from, but he'll frequently ignore that also, which is, we would consider that to be a flaw in his methodology. To at least refer to the source of the book, that would be important. That's what we see Suyuti's methodology was, that he referred you to the book at least from which the statement was taken. There are two reasons for cutting the isnad. One is that he wanted to shorten his work, and he did call it al-Wajiz, the short. The other justification for it is that by the time that he was working, the Sunnah and the Athar had been thoroughly documented and they were present in books. And so scholars who were reading his books, perhaps he presumed that they would know where to look to check out his narrations without his having to spell it out for them. And so he quotes hadith fairly frequently, and he quotes the statements of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. With regard to opinion, he'll frequently quote a variety of opinions on an issue, and he won't make tarjih. He won't choose what he thinks is the strongest. And when he doesn't do that, there's usually a reason for it, which is, in his introduction, he says that it's possible for a verse to carry multiple levels of meaning or facets of meaning, and sometimes he'll quote a variety of opinions on a thing. For instance, seek help through patience and prayer in Surah al-Baqarah. I think verse 45, I'm not sure. And the explanation of sabr, patience there, there's various explanations. One is that it's fasting and, various explanations. And he says that, all of these can be facets of that meaning. And similarly with hikmah, in the verse 269 in al-Baqarah, He gives wisdom. Allah gives wisdom to whom He wills. Some said it's the Qur'an, some said it's the Sunnah, some said it's generic wisdom. And again, He said there's no reason why it couldn't be all of those. And then sometimes He'll point out that, for instance, الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ in verse 3 of al-Baqarah, what is exactly meant by al-Ghayb? When he quotes earlier Mufassirs, some of them mentioned this, some of them mentioned that, and he pointed out that none of them was, when they said those things, none of them were trying to be exhaustive. They were just giving examples. And so all of those are acceptable. And sometimes he does make tarjih on the basis, sometimes on the basis of linguistic factors, like in the verse where the Bani Israel are asking Musa for مِمَّا تُنْبِتُ الْأَرْضُ مِنْ بَقْلِهَا وَقِثَّائِهَا. There's these various types of food that are mentioned that they're asking Musa to ask Allah to give them this food instead of manna and salwa. They're tired of manna and salwa. So one of the types of food that's mentioned there is foom, which Pixel translates as garlic, which normally it's called thum. Garlic is called thum. This sounds like thum. So he translated it as garlic. However, Ibn Atiyah interpreted that to mean wheat, and he gave a verse of poetry to support that. And sometimes he'll make tarjih on the basis of a hadith, sometimes on the basis of logic. For instance, Surah Al-Ra'd, verse 2, it is Allah who erected the heavens without pillars that you can see. And so he rejected the idea of pillars at all. And he said if there were physical pillars, they would have to rest on something, and that something would have to rest on something, and that would have to rest on something, and that would be what's called tasalsul, an endless chain, regressing chain. And so the idea of pillars there is something more abstract, is what he's saying. And then the requirements of context and wording, he sometimes makes tarjih on that basis. Sometimes he'll reject an explanation because it just requires too convoluted a reading. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, also verse 214, the passage is talking. It says, "Do you think that you will enter paradise while there has not yet come to you the like of what came to those who passed away before you? Affliction and adversity befell them. They were shaken as with an earthquake, till the messenger," meaning the messenger of Allah, "and those who believed along with him said, when will Allah's help come? Surely Allah's help is near." Now, some scholars, they felt, that this was an aqidah issue, that how could a prophet say that? So they said what it meant really is that this was a kind of a compressed wording, and that the followers said, when will Allah's help come? And that the prophet said, his answer was, surely Allah's help is near. And Ibn Atiyah, he rejected this because it requires a tortuous and convoluted reworking of the meaning that is against the apparent meaning of the words as they are. And he tended to favor comprehensive explanations over those which were more limited. In verse 27 of al-Baqarah, those who break the covenant of Allah after ratifying it and sever that which Allah ordered to be joined. So what was it that Allah ordered to be joined? There are some very specific things like silatul rahim, yani ties of kinship, and he favored a more comprehensive explanation. And sometimes he'll bring his own opinion that nobody had previously given his particular explanation. And he has a heavy linguistic and grammatical emphasis, but not so much on balagha, rhetoric. He pays attention to variant recitations, and he's pretty hostile to symbolic interpretation, especially Baltani interpretation. And with regard to Aqidah, he's an Ash'ari. He quotes from Abu al-Hasan, he quotes from al-Baqillani, and he quotes from Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni on Aqidah issues. Al-Baghawee is more of a Salafi in his Aqidah.